Nicole Kett, who's Director of Resources and Policy at the Defence Nuclear Organisation in the Ministry of Defence, comes to us with a varied and senior background in a variety of different departments. And she has, a really interesting brief, I think, in the MoD. And so she's going to talk a little bit today about how that all works, about how the UK PONI community, about how all of you at different stages of your career fit into the vision that the government has, I suppose, for the nuclear enterprise, for the nuclear weapons enterprise, and I think it's also some personal reflections on your route to where you are now, which I think hopefully will be very interesting. So Nicole's going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, then we'll have time for questions. So with that, over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Right, try not to fall over my own handbag. Right, good morning, everybody. Hope you've all had coffee. I'm running on 2 coffees. That's normally okay for a while. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm really pleased to have been asked to do this. So I came across PONI a couple of years ago as part of my kind of induction into this role, and I've really been impressed and supported. I came to last year's conference for some elements of it. And I think, I suppose I have to accept that I'm now, given I'm doing the keynote, I've now reached that point in my career, and obviously that point in my age, where I'm considered suitable for keynote addresses and no longer suitable to sit on a table with people who are possibly at the beginning of their careers or not as far as I am into mine. So that's good for me to make sure that I get to meet new people as well. PONI overall, I think, is an excellent idea. I mean, generally, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but just getting kind of younger people, make sure the pathways are there for people to move into all industries, but particularly defence, security, nuclear, for me. These are really interesting places to work, and having the roots in is vitally important. And events like this are really good. I would advise you very strongly to make sure you come away from this with a couple of people that you kind of keep in touch with and that you've made some contacts somewhere. That's the best benefit of these things, that and the free lunches and stuff like that. So I will give you a bit of an overview. So my job title, the clue is in the job title. I'm the Director for Resources and Policy. So resources in MoD speak means finance to everybody else. So I'm a finance director, but I'm also a policy director in the defence nuclear bit of MoD. So I will today just give you a little bit of an overview of how the policy framework in which I operate, so which is the government's policy framework, okay. Now, some of you will sit here today and hear some really interesting discussions, and you will have the opportunity and the freedom to say what you think and your personal views. Some of this will not be my personal views. I'm going to tell you what the government's policy is on nuclear deterrent, and I am a senior civil servant, so don't ask me what I think personally about any of those things. Okay, I'm just telling you that. You can try, but I probably won't answer. So, but I want to explain what it is and how that means that we operate and the kind of things that maybe I think about, and then a little bit about me and how I've ended up in this place, which any of you that have read the biography in the pamphlet will think, how on earth did she find her way here? So I will do that. And there'll be plenty of time to ask questions at the end. So first of all, my day-to-day role, what is the UK's nuclear deterrence policy? Well, first and foremost, many of you are actually involved in this without knowing or knowing obviously about it. Essentially, either working on the programmes that we have to renew our deterrent, or some of you are more in the academic field where you will be considering whether or not what the deterrent is and how it should act. You are all involved in this as well. So I live and breathe it day to day, but I'm just living and breathing it in a slightly different way. We're all probably doing that in many, many different ways. You've got some excellent speakers, I think, coming up, and you've got some great topics. So I'm not going to sit here and try and say I know more than them or anything like that, because you will know much more than me, and I'm not going to give you a history lesson, so that's quite good. I have to say, though, since starting this job, if anyone wants to know, I've got a great reading list, and I can recommend all sorts of things to read, because I don't know if it's still called this, but I've done quite a lot of reading around my subject ever since I started this job. I've got a whole bookshelf of books about nuclear stuff. It is important, though, I think, to remember how history plays a role in nuclear deterrence policy. I mean, some of you may know that we recently reached the milestone of 50 years of continuous at-sea deterrence. So that's how we operationalise our nuclear deterrent. So this is, in many ways, an absolutely remarkable achievement in many different ways. Technology is an incredible thing, but also just on a human endeavour. I was going to try and work out how many man or woman hours that equated to, but I kind of ran out of time. So if you're a bit bored listening to me, can you work out, please, how many man hours we've done? So we've done 50 years of continuous at-sea deterrent, 365 days a year, say an average of 100 people on a boat. If anyone can work out what that actually equates to in time and man hours whilst I'm talking, I'd be very grateful. But it's important to remember sometimes at the end of this, there are a bunch of human beings who are inside a boat at the bottom of the sea doing a job for all of us on a day-to-day basis, and nobody knows they're there, at least that is the intent, and but they are absolutely essential to our national security. So it's a really important milestone, and from a defence perspective, it's something that was marked and will continue to be marked, I think, during the course of the year. So first and foremost, I think the government is absolutely clear that retaining the nuclear deterrent and renewing it, i.e. updating our systems, our platforms, is the number one priority for defence and national security. So you will read a lot about whether defence has enough money, and there are people that argue it does and it doesn't, and all of that goes on in the background. But at the heart of it, there is always a priority, and it will and is always the nuclear deterrent. Now, just putting my finance director hat on just for a moment. That doesn't mean to say that I get given a blank cheque by anybody. The MoD doesn't get given a blank cheque by the Treasury. So every penny we spend on the deterrent, either renewing it, running it, whatever it is, building the new 4 submarines, I mean, that is public money. It's taxpayers' money, well, it's your money, and it's essential that we get the right value out of that, just as everything else that government spends its money on. So it is one of my responsibilities to ensure that we get the best value for money. So in other bits of you, I will be talking to colleagues in, for example, the Submarine Delivery Agency, or people that you, if you work in industry, will have some connection with, and I might be in the background just saying, ooh, how's that value for money, etc., etc. So that is a genuine requirement for us, and it's incumbent on us all to be really innovative and think about how we can get the best systems that we need, and use all of your innovation technology to get what we want, but for as little, well, not as little money as possible, best value as possible. Anyway, I'll take that. Is there any accountants in the room by any chance? No? Okay. Defence is the first duty of government. I don't know if there's any economists in the room, but it's a public good. So it is more efficient and effective for the government to provide defence than it is for the market, and to provide citizens with the security that they expect. And I do think it's an absolute given. Quite often, I used to work in the Treasury, and we would go out to people and say, where should we spend the money? Where should we put all the money? And it always came back, health and education, health and education. Never comes back with defence. Never. No one ever says, can we spend some more money on guns and ships and boats and things? But I think that's because it's a given. I think people assume it's there. It's banked. They assume that we will provide it for them. So it's kind of the no-brainer as far as I'm concerned in terms of what it is that we do and why we do it. It is what is expected of our citizens, and that is why the MoD exists to a large extent. It's not just to fight wars, in case anyone was wondering. So the UK government, even where we are today, which is quite turbulent times, interestingly, there is still, I think, broad consensus around our position as a nuclear weapon state and having a nuclear deterrent. The last vote that Parliament had on this was about in 2016, and that was to whether or not we should start to build the new deterrent submarines. And that vote was actually won by a margin of 355, which even in our turbulent times of constitutional goodness knows what, is a pretty hefty margin, and it's not something that you see people. There is some speculation, I think, about the opposition and their position, but their official policy is to retain the nuclear deterrent. So I think there's a broad consensus in government, which often there isn't on many things. So we have our policy. We will be a nuclear weapon state. We will have a deterrence. But there are lots of responsibilities that come with that, and it's very important. So we set out our policy in the UK. I'm going to hold up. I've got a prop. Our policy. The government's policy is set out in this. This is my own personal copy. It's got doodles and things. But we publish around every 4 to 5 years, depending on how governments are going, the National Security Strategy and Defence Review. This sets out, in black and white, in writing, our nuclear policy or our nuclear doctrine. If someone can tell me the difference between a doctrine and a policy as well today, that would be fantastic, because I've never worked it out. Maybe Tom can do that for me. So we have made certain commitments in public about our deterrent and our policy. So the UK has committed that we have said we will only use our weapons in extreme circumstances. Well, that's a given. But in the defence of the UK and its allies, some states don't make such a statement. This states very, very clearly that we would never use our nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapons state party to and in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So in policy parlance, you might hear this later, that's called a negative security assurance. So if someone is signed up to the NPT, as we call it, that's the assurance we make to them. And finally, we do not target our weapons at any state, although we remain ready at 5 days' notice to fire. Now, it's quite interesting. I was recently at the UN conference around the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and it was quite surprising how few people understood that that was our policy, and that actually people thought it was far, far more vague, ambiguous, and that actually we were all still on, 15 minutes to fire or something that has been gone for a very long time. So we have taken steps. We see ourselves as a very responsible nuclear weapon state to state as far as we can what our policy and our doctrine is, so that there is a lack of ambiguity about that. There is still some ambiguity in it, but not as much as others. And also, as non-proliferation, you're going to be talking about, there'll be discussions around ban treaties today, arms control. It's quite a hot topic at the moment. But the reality is that the global situation doesn't allow any nuclear weapon state to get to a point where they feel that, relinquishing nuclear weapons today, tomorrow, is a realistic possibility. It's unfortunate, but that's the security situation we're in. And there's a couple of things I'd point out. I mean, Russia, for example, has massively renewed its, modernized its military, including its nuclear forces. President Putin likes to do nice big State of the Union addresses with slides and goodness knows what, showing all the fantastic new novel capabilities that the Russians are developing, which on some level might well be a bit of bluster, but on the other is very real. And we should take it seriously. And that kind of approach is something that we cannot ignore. North Korea, obviously, we're all well aware of the fact that they've tested weapons, and whilst they're in dialogue with the US, it's not clear how that will end. So there are genuine and real security issues in the world today that are difficult and that we have to work within and be aware of as we make our way through the nuclear world. As a counterbalance, I would argue that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has done a really good job. It came into force 50 years ago, and it has enabled, it's put a brake on, I think, genuinely, what would have happened in those 50 years. It's a counterfactual, who knows, but I think it's a force for good. There are others that think it isn't, and thereby there is a new ban treaty. It's shorthand, it's a bit, but my Swedish colleague will talk about that later today. But the NPT means that we in the UK, we've made firm commitments to arms control. So we have embraced the policy of minimum credible deterrent, and the way that's articulated for us is we only have one platform, so we have a submarine as our deterrent. Every other country has more than that. They have things they can fly and things that come out the ground and all sorts of exciting stuff. We have chosen not to do that. We think we don't require that. And we have reduced the stockpile of our actual weapons to a degree that we think is still able for us to be credible, but is sensible in arms control. This is a topic that will come up more and more. You will see more and more, I think, about arms control in the coming months in the policy space. There are lots of, in August, for example, the INF Treaty, so that was the treaty between Russia and the US, will probably fall on the 2nd of August. That was a very old treaty signed by Gorbachev, I think, and it's going to fall away, and it's a great shame, but we have to accept that the reason it's fallen away is because Russia were non-compliant and they broke the treaty, and therefore you cannot have people going around breaking treaties. So it's unfortunate, but that's the world we are in. But it means that a lot of people are talking about how can we ensure that arms control is an important pillar of what we do in this world. So that's kind of the policy framework in which I work in every day, and the team works in every day. The Defence Nuclear Organisation, we are responsible in MoD for, we're a dedicated organisation to nuclear. We're still quite new, been up and running a few years now, a couple of years. And the idea of bringing us together was to enable us to tackle everything in the nuclear enterprise. So policy starts with the policy, but we do everything all the way through to the capability requirement. So I work with lots of Navy colleagues who sit there and say, this is the kind of submarine I want. I work with scientists who say, this is the kind of warhead the UK would require. We work with our delivery partners, which are mainly AWE and the Submarine Delivery Agency, who go away and make those a reality. And then we also do the funding of all of that activity, and we also actually, at the very end of it, have to worry about the decommissioning of things as well. So, you know, nuclear is a long, you will all know, it's a long-term thing, nuclear. It isn't a 5-minute process. So we have enormous programs that go on for 50 years or so. And part of the role of our organisation is to have that overview of all of it. And that enables us, I think, to do several things. It enables us to make better decisions, so we can see the full picture, so we can make better decisions around what we require and what we don't require. But also it means that we're a very diverse organisation in terms of the skill sets that we have. So we have military, civilian, scientists, engineers, financiers, commercial people, everything in between, specialists, non-specialists. And it also enables us specifically to look at skills across the enterprise. Now, this is a big area in terms of both private industry and defence, but I have found it fascinating that we've had to kick off a piece of work to really understand what people we have doing what, even in defence. So what skill base do we have? And do we have the people coming through? So to be frank, I see quite a lot of old people. I mean, I might be an old person myself, but I see quite a lot of old people. And they're great, but, you know, at some point they're all going to go away. So we need some non-older people. So I am really, really interested in what we can do, working with industry, working with other government departments, to get a handle on what is the skills that we're going to require over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and how are we, in Ministry of Defence, has joined up with everybody else in ensuring that we can play a part in that. I actually think industry is ahead of government on this in some regards. I think industry works really, really well in identifying new people and bringing on new people, and a lot of you work in industry, and there's not so many of you that work in defence, although I can see a couple over in the corner. But I'm really keen, how can we break down the barriers? How can we work between us? And it would be interesting to see if you have views about that. Government can be a bit sticky and a bit bureaucratic, so we're not as flexible at doing things like secondments and stuff like that, but I'm really interested in that kind of thing. And I want to make the defence nuclear enterprise in MoD an interesting, inspiring place to work. I don't want it to be seen as, stuck in that building down Whitehall behind closed doors and no one ever gets out. We're trying to get out a bit more. So you may be looking at me, well, I'm talking about skills, but, what about me? Where's my nuclear credentials? Well, before you start to really worry about it, I will admit that before I started this role, which is about 3 years ago, I had absolutely zero defence or nuclear experience. Zero. Nothing whatsoever. Before you get very alarmed about that, given the responsibilities of my job, I think I will try and explain a bit and why it's fine. So I am a career civil servant. And I began very, very long time ago in very operational roles. So without reciting my CV, I have done all sorts of things. I've been a benefits fraud officer. I've interviewed people under caution. That's quite good fun. I've been a welfare policy expert. I've taken legislation through the House. I've been a minister's private secretary. I was Margaret Hodges' private secretary. Ask me later. I'm not going to talk on camera about that. I have worked in some way, shape or form on every single spending review that this government has done since 1997. And whilst I was in the Treasury, I think I worked out by the time I'd left, I had completed around 15 fiscal events, that's budgets, basically. So I had done all of those things. And I've also managed commercial relationships with suppliers from a government side. So a lot of background there, and a lot of it actually within finance and the finance community and Treasury and places like that. So that's been my kind of anchor, if you like, for the last 20 odd years or so. I didn't start there, started more policy, but I've ended up in finance. And actually that's given me a route. So my profession has given me a route in to other places. So frankly, and this is why I talked about networks earlier today, the way I got my job was that I was known in the finance community. I had a network of finance community colleagues across government, and somebody was looking to fill the role, and someone said, oh, we know Nicole, let's have a think, let's see if she's interested. And it was that. I didn't apply for it formally at that stage. It was literally having a background and building up networks over many years and having an anchor in a career. So now there was a slight hitch in that because someone said, oh, Nicole, there's this job. It's nuclear. And I was like, oh, yes, no, excellent. Wow, that sounds really, really interesting. And then had to quickly go away and Google UK nuclear deterrent because it never crossed my mind. And this comes back to my thought earlier about it's a given. So I knew we had nuclear weapons, but I literally had no idea what we did in this space, what the government provided. So I did go away and I Googled it and I found out that we had 4 submarines and we had CASD and all this kind of stuff. And I also reflected at the time, this was a massive change from when I was younger as a child of the 80s. I was incredibly aware of what nuclear was. Not in terms of how it was created or how we did these things, but it was like front and centre of so much of what we were doing and as growing up at that time. And, the very real threat that people felt about the prospect of nuclear war, these things were not, they're not fiction, they were true. And I found it interesting, fascinating that it had just totally fallen away. And that, I think, there's part of the reason that was the ending of the Cold War, which also has a relevance to where we find ourselves today, which is as an enterprise, as an industry, as a business, whatever you want to call it, I think a lot of us we lost people, we lost the skills, we lost some of the understanding, and we're now building all of that back up again. So it was fascinating when I was sort of like, do you want to do this? I had to go, oh, yes, I do, but I don't know what it is, but I'll go and find out. So, however, now today, it's front and centre of everything I do, so now I know everything. Pretty much there is today, she says, apart from all the technical stuff. You guys will know much better than that. I have spent the last few years educating myself on all things nuclear, as I said. It's a hugely complex area. I love it. It's the most interesting job I've ever had in government. I can honestly say even more interesting than interviewing people under caution for benefit fraud. some of the challenges I've faced in coming into this role are very basic ones. Understanding what people are talking about. So I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, but people ask me to give them money to do that kind of stuff. And I sit there and I might read a business case and then I'll go, okay, fine, what exactly is it that you want to do? Because it's a little bit impenetrable to me. So one of my challenges is to try and encourage us all to, for all you people who are experts, learn how to explain what you do to people like me who aren't, but who might give you the money to do what you want. It's a really important skill. I would develop that. In the MoD, I've worked in lots of other departments. MoD, it's fair to say I had not been the only woman in a meeting for a good 15 years before I shipped up at the MoD. That's a fact of life. It's getting a bit better, but it's still not great, and there is a lot of work to do on that. MoD more generally, acronym-tastic, alphabet soup. My way of managing that is just to call it out and say, I don't know what you're talking about. What does that mean? And quite often people don't know what the acronym means, which is quite amusing. And I think more just generally finding my way through this world. Really tough, really difficult. And if you find that, don't worry about it. It does make a bit more sense, and just keep asking questions would be my advice. I'm happy to talk about more of my personal experiences in Q&A because that might be better in some ways. I'm probably going to shut up now and actually give you some time to ask questions. My team did suggest that I should kind of finish off with, if I was, think back to when I either started my career or I know I'm 25 years old, what advice would I give myself? Which is a really hard question. So I thought about that a lot last night. And I'm like, oh no, is it that, that boyfriend with the weird hair, should have ditched him earlier, listened to my mum probably a bit better, eaten a bit more healthily. But I think, in all honesty and reflection, it was very simple. I have never had a plan. I've never had a career plan. Okay, I've always done what interests me and what I enjoy. And I've never been afraid to try slightly different things. You spend an awful lot of your life working, and you guys will spend more of your life working than I'm going to spend my life working, because unfortunately you're all going to have to work till you're older than I do, which is a whole other discussion we can have somewhere else. But if you're doing something that you don't really want to get up for in the morning and you don't feel like you're adding some value or you enjoy it, it's a long time to go. So, always make sure that you do what interests you. Be curious, ask questions. And so I never had a plan to be standing here today. I am standing here today. I'm fortunate, but I think it's because I kind of took that approach in many ways. And I'm always happy to try something new and something different, even though I'm not 25 anymore, far from it. So that is the advice that I would give to myself at the age of 25, and listen to your mother a bit more, I think. So I am going to stop now. I'll sit down, but you can please ask questions or comments, or if there's something I've said that you think was a load of baloney or you would like to know more, I'm happy to talk about it. But other than that, I'm going to keep quiet. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Nicole.